Hello everyone, it's Mr. E here, and today I'm talking about a game that is nearly 7 years old. Isn't that crazy to think that Vermintide 2 is almost 7? That is really absurd when I think about the very first days of playing that game way back in 2018. Wow, those were some ancient times, it feels like at this point. But I wanted to talk about Vermintide 2 and specifically compare it to Darktide, because I see a lot of discussion online about whether or not, Darktide has successfully taken the torch, whether it's replacing Vermintide 2, whether it's better, whether Vermintide 2 is better and just, they've flubbed the sequel. And I think that these two sort of siblings, I'll call them, they have a unique dynamic as opposed to games from other developers. Whereas other developers will release further games and they'll solely improve upon their recipe, I think that Darktide does show a regression in some senses, so I could totally get behind the idea that Vermintide 2 might actually have an edge over Darktide in some respects. So I've just got a quick list of things that I'd like to go down here, and I'll be awarding a point to each, either Darktide or Vermintide, based on which one I think comes out ahead for each evaluation. And this will just be a nice sort of casual way of keeping track of which one I think really comes out ahead. And obviously, all of this comes down to personal preference. A lot of it really comes down to which really jives with you, because both these games are so gameplay driven, are so fundamentally down to, do you enjoy the mechanics of how the game feels and plays? And if you just don't get it with Vermintide, or you just don't get it with Darktide, you're going to prefer the other. So let's first talk about the cost, because if you haven't gotten either of these games, you might be wondering which one is worth the money. Well, Vermintide 2 comes out ahead here. Both of these games employ microtransactions. Vermintide 2 has microtransactions for paid DLC for different maps and weapons and stuff like that, which I don't love. However, they're very reasonably priced, and the base game for Vermintide 2 is absolutely dirt cheap. In fact, sometimes it's literally been free. So I don't think Darktide can quite say that, but maybe eventually Darktide will be able to compete in that level. But if you're just looking to maybe pick up one of these games, I have to give the edge to Vermintide there, because you can get it for like $5 or less a good portion of the time, and it's a great value proposition for that amount of money. Performance is a really bad sticking point for Darktide, and therefore I have to award this point to Vermintide. Vermintide is obviously 7 years old, but they've done a lot of work on the granted, it's a really bad engine that I think they're moving away from for their next game, but Vermintide has been optimized fairly well over the years, and it runs at a consistent 120 FPS on my computer, but Darktide is all over the place. Some days I'll be running at good frames, and then other days, for whatever reason, the thing is absolutely tanking. I'm getting like frame drops, I'm getting stuttering, and I can't tell if it's my computer or if it's the game. I have to assume it's the game, because everything else plays fine on my rig. So I gotta give that performance point to Vermintide. In the same vein, when we're talking about performance, we are obviously referencing graphics, and this one very clearly goes to Darktide. Vermintide is a beautiful game at times, but personally, I feel that a lot of the environments feel over-cluttered. It's something about the art style. Everything is rendered in the same fidelity, and we have lots and lots of objects that make up the environments. It gets very busy to look at, if that makes any sense. You'll see some of the footage here, and it isn't exactly the cleanest game to look at. It isn't visually polished in the way that Darktide is. And then, to compare that to Darktide, Darktide is visually a beautiful game. It's something that we often overlook, but the enemy designs, the character designs, weapon designs, the environments especially are absolutely drop-dead gorgeous, even on low settings. So there's really no contest here, and I'm certain that all of that taxes on computers, and it's why the performance is so bad, but gotta give the graphics to Darktide. let's talk about weapons. So weapons is a big thing in both of these games, but I think it's even bigger in Darktide. And Darktide is really the game that runs with the differentiation between weapons and makes it its whole thing. Vermintide has a lot of different weapons. Some weapons, dual wielding stuff that doesn't return in Darktide, but it just lacks the oomph, the pizzazz that Darktide really has. Obviously Darktide has standout weapons like the Flamer, the Plasma Gun, the Chain Swords, the Thunder Hammers, those really meaty and impactful weapons that are very flashy. They may not be the best weapons in the game, but they're really cool, and they add up to a lot of very different ways to play the game. Versus Vermintide, yes, it has a good number of melee weapons and a few range weapons as well, but none of them are really differentiated. They have their own movesets, and learning their intricacies is quite involved, but they don't have anything that particularly makes me want to go, oh my god, I can't wait to play with the Falchion. What a amazing feeling weapon. Everything is it's a melee weapon, right? But Darktide has just such great polish on those weapons. It feels amazing to, especially if you're a Warhammer or 40k fan. You've got such great crowd service for some of these weapons. They're the best representations of the bolter I think I've ever seen in a game. So I have to give just the pure feel of playing with these weapons to Darktide. As far as progression systems, we have some serious problems in both of these games, obviously. Progression is very awkward in Darktide, right? Darktide has gotten a lot better with time, though. Now you can target farm for a certain weapon. If you really want, say, a chainsword, you can pick up that chainsword and play with it for a certain number of games, get your crafting materials up, and power up your chainsword with those materials and invest points into the mastery to unlock the blessings you need. And I think they've really kind of nailed it down. I mean, it took them 2 years, but they really kind of nailed down the recipe for how to progress your character. In addition to that, we have the 30 levels of progression for getting all of your talent points. And I think that's okay. It's not my favorite progression system I've ever seen in a game, but it's fine. And it doesn't potentially last forever. Vermintide, on the other hand, has a terror of a progression system. If you're playing in normal adventure modes, and perhaps you're a player who played this years ago and you've forgotten about this, but I remember it in thinking about this video, introducing your friends to play this game with you, if you're a level 30 character and you have maximum power level, which is the gear equivalent in that game, and you invite your friends to play with you, well, they are locked out of playing games until they have a certain amount of power. And in order to get power, you have to crack open chests. And chests were in the game, they're loot boxes, because Vermintide 2 came out right after the Overwatch craze of loot boxes, so we had to have loot boxes. And the only way you could upgrade your power was by cracking open more and more loot boxes, and every time you cracked one open, it would raise your power level for your character by a little bit. It would raise the item level of the weapons that would drop from the crate by a little bit, like between 1 and 5 points, I think it was. And there's obviously 300 is the maximum power level, and you start at 100. So it can be a very long time before you are able to get your weapons to where they need to be in order to compete on the higher level difficulties. And that was just horrible as a new player, being introduced to the game and trying to play with your friends, because yeah, you're locked out of playing on the hard and actually interesting difficulties, and if you do finally get enough power level to get into those games, you are going to be hugely underpowered, because the lack of just the stat called power on your weapons means you do less damage, you stagger enemies less, obviously you have less stats like attack speed and crit and all that stuff. It just feels worse to play. I really enjoy that you can get a weapon up and running and have reasonably good stats on it within a couple of games in Darktide, and it makes it so much more enjoyable to roll a new class, to play with people for the first time. So I have to give the overall progression system to Darktide. It's not the perfect thing, but it is a huge improvement from where Vermintide was. All right, then we've got to talk about classes. Now, classes is a curious question. Some of you might remember that when Darktide released, the intent was to have one additional subclass released each quarter. So by the end of year 1, we were supposed to have our main classes being Zealot, Ogryn, all that stuff. And remember, they had subtitles. It was called Zealot Preacher, Ogryn, I think Bone Breaker, and then Psyker Psykinetic, and Veteran Sharpshooter. Those were our original subclasses, and they were intending to add more. Well, that all went out the window when they introduced the talent tree in patch 13, and I think that's for the better. It increases the amount of build diversity astronomically. The amount of variation, little tweaks and stuff that you can make to builds in Darktide is really, really big because of those variations. However, I think that the balancing, because there has been really no revisit to these talent trees in over a year, I think the balancing between those talent tree things are really, really poor. And if you know what you're doing, if you are playing with the best stuff, you kind of have a narrow band of what you can use. There are lots and lots of ultimate abilities that are just worse than others, especially on like Veteran. Veteran has one hugely standout ultimate abilities, and the other ones are kind of trash. Compare this to Vermintide's having one ultimate ability per career, and there are now 20 careers if you have the DLCs. All of those careers have their own independent weapons that they cannot share with certain other classes. So I kind of like that design, honestly. This one is very, very narrow to differentiate which classes come out ahead for me, but I really think I prefer the Vermintide setup. I love the talent tree. I wish that the talent tree was a thing back in Vermintide days. I understand it's a lot more work, but I like that diversity that the classes, the different classes, even within the subclasses, even within an overall class, provided in Vermintide. Because you could be a dwarf main and you could play a berserker melee character, you could play a full tank, you could play a DPS / support character, and you could play a like ranged sniper, also support character, but like a different type. Those are all archetypes that you could play within just playing the dwarf, and that felt really, really cool. I think one problem is, well, the problem and the reason behind the problem is that Vermintide 2 has had a long time to balance these against each other. They've figured out which one of these archetypes, these subclasses, were high points. We were outliers on the high end and on the low end, and they balanced them against each other. Darktide really needs a balance pass on its talents, because there are things that are just far better than others in many cases, and I would love to see more differentiation between some of this stuff, because so many builds, you might take a different ultimate ability, but 95% of the other points you allot in your tree are just going to be the same 5 things. So I will very narrowly give this point to, as far as the classes, which one I prefer the classes in, to Vermintide 2. Maps and modes. Now, this is a very narrow victory again to Vermintide 2, only because I think it's had so much longer to develop its maps, and one thing I really, really love about the maps in Vermintide 2 is how different they all feel. We have maps where you're exploring a big haunted castle. We have maps in frozen tundra where you are like walking across glaciers and stuff like that. We have maps that are, just walking through a field of grain or in an elven forest. Really like kind of explores the world, and I love those different sceneries. It's not as pretty as Darktide is in a lot of places, but Darktide, yes, it has a lot of maps, not as many as Vermintide 2 does. It has a lot of maps, but so many of those maps feel very familiar and reused because they are reused. Every map that shares a overarching area with the other maps in its set, like the relay station and all those ones that are what is it? It's like the sandy maps, right? They all share tile sets. You'll cross across the same tiles in those maps as you do in the others. The ones that take place in inside of Tertium, in places, they all, like the subway maps, any map that has a subway station, you can see you intersect with the same tile sets. Archivum Sycorax and Enclavum Barros, they intersect in certain tiles. So they're reusing parts of these maps, and it doesn't really differentiate them. Even though they are beautiful, it doesn't differentiate them and leave you feeling like, oh, this is a completely different mission, which is something I really sorely miss from Vermintide 2. We also have a big disparity in terms of gameplay options for modes. Vermintide 2, obviously it's been out longer, but it not only has the Havoc game mode in the form of weaves, albeit they're pretty shit compared to Havoc, and that's saying something. We also have Chaos Waste, which is awesome and optional fun that can always extend your playtime and enjoyment of the game. And there is Endless Horde Siege mode stuck in there somewhere. Yeah, so I think that the modes and the ways to play Vermintide 2 right now is just more enjoyable, and I love the world-spanning adventure of this. I understand we're stuck in a hive city in Darktide, and that's just sort of the aesthetic we're going for, but it does feel a little bit samey after a while, wouldn't you agree? So this is the point where I'll say like and subscribe, because I'm about to discuss the gameplay of these two games. And if I come down on the side that you're not a fan of, you might never watch one of my videos again, so you should subscribe before you tune out. But this is a very hotly contested debate. Which of these two games, Vermintide 2 or Darktide, has the better gameplay? Now, the advocates for Vermintide 2 are oftentimes veterans who've played it for many hundreds, if not thousands of hours, and the value that they say that Vermintide 2 has, which I tend to agree with, is that Vermintide 2 represents a narrow and perfected recipe. It's got a very tight core set of rules, and it's very focused on melee fundamentals. If you do not have correct spacing, dodging, aiming, like all that stuff, if you don't have it really down pat, there's nothing else that's going to bail you out. It is just you and a lot of personal mechanical skill against the hordes, and those hordes are incredibly aggressive, especially because you have less tools to deal with them with. On the dark side of things, we have a much more forgiving melee system, which has enemies that telegraph their moves more visibly, and we have a ton of different utilities, of different things that we can use to solve situations. Packs, big, huge chaos patrols and stuff like that, no problem. We have veteran shout, we have flamethrowers, we have all sorts of tools at our disposal. The situation just needs to be assessed, and then you use your tools to deal with it. And yes, that does take some of the mechanical challenge out of the game at times. A lot of times, Darktide can feel a bit like an MMO, where you're just trying to spam your abilities as soon as they come off of cooldown. But overall, I think I do have to side with Darktide being the better gameplay, because Darktide to me represents a refinement of Vermintide 2. I still get to engage in that high-octane melee gameplay that I did in Vermintide 2, but a lot of those rough edges have been sanded down and made so much more smooth and streamlined and palatable. And then you have to consider that we have this new hybridized combat where you can be swapping between your ranged and melee weapons with some fluidity. It really does amp up the recipe a little bit when everybody has access to sprinting and sliding and slide dodging and all of the stuff that can make you an absolute terror on the battlefield. There are just so many more mechanics, and therefore there's so many more mechanics that you can master. Does the game have the same difficulty where, Vermintide 2 has all these modded difficulties and stuff that can really test whether or not you have the mastery? I think they're working towards it with Havoc, but really when it comes down to it, if I had to play one game or the other for another 500 hours, I think I would go with Darktide, just because the moment-to-moment enjoyment that I get out of the actual combat is just there a little bit more for me. So I'm sorry if you fall in the Vermintide 2 things. I totally see your perspective. It's just that I think that Darktide has been a slight improvement over Vermintide 2's recipe, and I would be very concerned for Darktide if I didn't feel that way. Now, which of these games has the least jank? And if you don't know what jank means, it's just a general term for having a lot of unpolished edges, having just, little, I don't want to say bugs, but just things that you have to deal with, just little idiosyncrasies of the game that throw you out of your immersion with it, because that's just the way the game is. If you've ever played one of the original Stalker games, or any game made in Eastern Europe for that matter, those games are classically referred to as being Slav jank. They aren't very well put together games. A lot of times they have weird systems, and you just kind of get frustrated dealing with them, but eventually you learn to love them for their flaws. I would say that Darktide is the less jank of these two games. The major issue that I have with jankiness, it comes down to Vermintide 2's combat. A lot of these enemies are skating all over the place. Again, this is a thing that you can learn to combat and account for, but the way that the game telegraphs how the enemies are moving, the way that bosses can snap and drop an overhead on you in the like in about 15 frames or so is just some next level shit. And I don't think that stuff is all necessarily intended. I don't think that enemies are supposed to change targets with no animation swap and then skate towards you while their feet are staying still. I think that's just part of the bugs of the engine, and it is a little bit frustrating to deal with. For Darktide's part, I think it does a better job at presenting the enemies as animating what they're supposed to do. There's less bullshit in general that can just kill you because the game is jank. That, people complain that specials don't have their sounds announced, but at least the hit indicators are being announced when enemies are swinging at you. About 75% of the time in Vermintide, those hit indicators are not being announced, and enemies are just are far too sneaky with how they can just seemingly slide in right behind you and get their hits in. So I have to award Darktide as being less jank than Vermintide. But in the same vein, which one of these has more glitches or bugs? It's definitely Darktide that has the worst end of this deal, so I'll be giving this point, the positive point, to Vermintide here. Darktide has so many game-breaking bugs right now, so many ways you can crash out, so many ways that the game will just steal FPS from you. It's becoming, just sort of this mystery as to whether or not to, it's my system, or it's the game, or a certain patch, or a mod, or what is fucking with my setup. But yeah, it's in a really bad state right now, and hopefully in about 5 years we can get all those ironed out and be in the state that Vermintide 2 is in, relatively bug-free in 2025. Enemies. Which game has better enemies? Well, Vermintide 2 has an advantage here in the sense that it has 3 different races of enemies. However, what it really comes down to for me is 2 factors. One is the specials selection, and personally, I don't feel that Vermintide 2 has very many threatening specials at all. The most threatening special is, bar none, the hook rat. Everyone knows it's the hook rat. The guy's a borderline tank, and he can grab you through all sorts of stuff. He's an instant kill if he can get you far enough away from your team. Yes, jump rats, gun runners are threatening in their own right, but they're easily dispatched if you're paying attention at all. And there's really nobody else that threatens the team quite in the way the hook rat does. But if you look over on the Darktide side of the aisle, we have flamers who can just instantly melt the whole team. We have gas and fire bombers. We have trappers, of course, and hounds and mutants just throw off your pace and make you dodge or push when you wish you could be doing anything else. They really, really endeavor to make your gameplay as hard as possible, and I think all that, combined with the fact that Darktide has so much more advanced and intentional AI. The biggest problem that I have with Vermintide 2's AI is that it's pretty much brain dead, like half of the time. You'll find specials just kind of like wandering in the middle of the open, like especially Globadiers will just like walk through the middle of your team. It'll spawn a Gatling rat to shoot at you, but it'll spawn it just in the middle of a field. Basically, it'll come around and you'll see it cresting the top of the hill with no cover or anything. Compare that to Darktide and the way that snipers will position themselves in the worst possible spots for you, where they can just barely get that vantage point and hold that line of sight and block you off, just area denial in that way. The way that bombardiers will throw grenades into your position and then reposition themselves so that you can't get a beat on them. It's very devious, it's very intentional, and I love that the game can exploit the mechanics of the level. It can exploit the geometry of the level and make you fight uphill into these fights. It makes it so much more engaging. And since so many more of these specials and these enemies force you to adapt your playstyles, and since we have ranged enemies to combat as well, that means more engaging, more learning about how to combat these threats, and therefore a more cool, fun game. So Darktide has the better enemies. Story and characters. Now, this isn't me personally, but I totally respect the fact that there are tons and tons of people out there who play games, especially games in the 40k universe, for the story, for the characters, for the connection to the greater universe and storyline that's being told here. And with that in mind, this has to go hands down to Vermintide 2. Even though Vermintide 2, being part of the End Times, which is now rebranded as Age of Sigmar, is a less popular franchise than 40k is with Darktide, there is almost no story being told in Darktide. It's told in very cryptic little tiny bits, and the amount of development we've had over the past 2 years has been peanuts compared to all the cool goings-ons that have happened between the Ubersreich 5 or 4, it doesn't really matter, in Vermintide 2. And if you are really invested in characters and their stories, Vermintide 2 is amazing because those developed 5 characters, Barden, Carillion, Sienna, Marcus, and Saltz, or Victor, I guess you should say his first name. All those guys are just amazing, fully fleshed out characters. You really do get a sense for who they are and how they work together and how they respect each other through the, just their interactions in the levels. Not only that, but levels, playing the adventure mode in that game has a story to tell. There are a series of missions that go back to back and tell a story together. And that is something that Darktide is sorely lacking, is any sense of like, oh, well, this is the next thing that we need to undertake is go and do the raid on Munitorum to get the supplies for this. And that'll enable us to go and take the fight to the Hourglass. Any sort of connective tissue like that Vermintide has between its levels, Darktide does not. I think there was some intention when the game released to have this being more of like a open worldy, like, choose your own adventure, and I don't really understand, because they had such a winning formula with Vermintide, the way that those characters interact, and the fact that they removed that and replaced them with just kind of the generic attitudes like that we have in the game now, the different voice lines that your characters can say. I think that's a cheap imitation of how awesome it was to have those fully fleshed out, real characters in the lore. And yes, it doesn't allow you to do like the Gordon Freeman thing and imagine yourself in their shoes because they're not a voiceless protagonist, but I so much prefer the story that was being told, the characters, and just all the side characters as well in Vermintide are amazing. Loner and Alicia, you really get a sense for who they are and their attitude. I find half of the handlers, the people that talk to you in missions in Darktide, just obnoxious personally. So gotta give this point, the characters and all that story stuff, that has to go to Vermintide. And finally, which of these games represents the better new player experience? Because believe it or not, there are probably people listening to this video right now that have not played either of these games and are contemplating whether they should get Game Pass to play Darktide or whether they should wait till Vermintide goes on some sort of sale and grab it up. I fully believe that you should get both of them, but in the interest of not copping out here, I will say that Darktide is 100% the better new player experience, and really thank God that it is, right? They should have fixed it by now. Darktide has a really nice leveling experience. You get every level you get an extra point to put into talents that feels really nice, that like hits that zone of the brain that says, oh, I'm making progress, I'm unlocking new features to my class. And then on the other side of the coin, you have the newly implemented, finally, crafting system where you can actually say, oh, I want to play with this axe or something, and you can target farm for that axe, you can collect the materials, you can improve the masteries, you can get the blessings that you need. You're no longer guessing in the dark. And the removal of the randomized chance is what sets this system so far ahead of Vermintide. So by comparison, the reason that Darktide really wins is because Vermintide's new player experience is terrible. You have to, one, level up your character to get power level, and if you don't have a certain power level, which is a combination of your character level and your weapon, like your gear level, you cannot play certain difficulties, and those thresholds are actually kind of steep. So instead of it being like in Darktide where you can play the heresy missions at like level 10 or whatever it is, you are waiting a very, very long time to engage with those upper level missions. Adding to that, the way that you progress your gear power by opening chests and hoping to randomly get stuff that you need, especially when it comes to red weapons, the perfectly rolled weapons, is just obnoxious, and it just ruins the game, especially if you're trying to get your friends to play it and they're like, why can't I join you in this game? Why do we have to keep playing recruit? Well, Timmy, you've only opened 3 chests. You need to open at least 10 chests to have the power level to play on veteran. It's just really, really annoying, and I'm so glad that they fixed that. I'm so glad they removed the randomized element, because long gone are the days of just like cracking open chests and praying to Allah that you would see a red falchion or whatever weapon you want in there. And Darktide has proved wholly on that experience. And that's everything, guys. So as you can see here, Darktide comes out ahead, in my estimation, just by a little bit. There's a lot of things here that they kind of shot themselves in the foot in terms of changing from Vermintide to Darktide. Things about like the way the story and the characters play out, just the overall like class diversity that they could have had if they'd had a more focused idea. I think if they'd really just committed to, hey, Vermintide 2 is a success, let's keep with this recipe and just make it in the 40k universe, we could have had just a straight upgrade as a game. Instead, it acts more as a side grade in some regards, but I think it's a better game. That's just how I feel anyway. Let me know what you feel down in the comments. Am I just off my rocker? Is Vermintide 2 really the OG and the better game of the two? And like and subscribe. I appreciate you all for watching, and I'll see you very soon. Mystery out. Bye.